I'm Shivaram. I'm the founder and CEO for Service Fractal. Mark is right here, Mark Hapner. So he's the chief architect. Uh, Before I start, I would really like to thank many players here. First of all, for Fawcett and OVS, because I think without which all of this conference to everything would not have happened. And to the vendors, because Allied Telesis, Cisco, Intel, and HP, they've all generously provided me with hardware for which I have been able to do some tests, and I'm just sharing some of the lessons that I've learned out of this in trying to make it work with the stuff that we are building, which I'm going to briefly talk about. And of course, Google has been a big supporter, and Amazon has also been a big supporter for us on a from all the other different aspects. So with that said, so I wanted to set the context a little bit in terms of what we do, so that you understand where I'm coming from and the kinds of thoughts that I have about why those requirements are really there. What we do is that at Service Fractal, we have built a cloud platform for networking and security. It's basically targeted towards enterprises, branch offices, and campus. That does not mean that data centers and service providers can't use it, but um, I have to make money now, not 10 years from now, for which I might be alive or not. I have no idea. So that's the main reason. And I don't know whether they will be in existence. Uh, the other thing is that we wanted to basically, all of our stuff is in the cloud. So, but we wanted to support the switching fabric and the networking fabric that is there on prem. So we are not really at this time focused on any. If you say I have a cloud deployment and I have switches and that kind of stuff, no, I'm not that very keen on that. But I'm really interested to make the hardware work a lot more better with the software. Our vision is to create a platform of applications. It's not really we don't want to boil the ocean. We don't want to give them more tools because we believe that there are enough tools. What we want to give them is business outcome specific applications, and we don't want to give more APIs because I think there are lots of developers who have enough APIs to program and write software. And I have no interest in training any operator. I want to look at the operator. You can basically plug and play. They can come in. They should be able to look at it or watch a video for about half an hour and be able to operate the infrastructure without having to get trained. I think those are basically our rough tenets in terms of how we want to do things. Uh, I really wanted to. I mean, I didn't want to put a sales slide or anything like that. So I just carved up some stuff just to show what it is that we are doing in very simplistic terms and in very raw stuff. Uh, there are two things that we do. One is that we collect streaming telemetry and events from the switches. The second thing is that we have the ability to dynamically control the infrastructure that is the same switches. And we can use a whole bunch of protocols, OpenFlow, SFlow, and GNMI and all the other things from a streaming telemetry point of view and be able to control it. Today, we do support OpenFlow on both sides, on both control as well as telemetry through Faucet. And we have things that are working on SFlow, but we haven't exposed it, and it's still there. We have still a little bit more work to do. Other things, all of the way our architecture is done is that you can actually plug and play all kinds of protocols in it, but ultimately they all go to we manage whatever data that needs to be managed at the back end and that kind of stuff, because we are providing all the necessary dashboards. And at the end of the day, people are really interested in business outcome specific applications. They want to know bandwidth. They have very specific things that they ask. Hey, I want to just do switch stacking or port mirroring. So how can we basically provide them those kinds of things? Just like when you go to a car and you say, hey, you turn on the wiper blade starts working. It's there. Okay. And you turn on the headlights come. Or you turn on the radio or turn off the radio, those things operate. We want to be just like that. And just like in a car, you can subscribe, or you can basically say, hey, I want the radio functionality, I want the GPS or the functionality, and so on and so forth. You can subscribe to any of that stuff. In our case, it's all going to be free. It's all based on data. How are we charging? So we basically charge around $250 a month for 100 gig of data. I don't care if you connect one switch or if you connect 100,000 switches, and whether it's a 1 gig port or a 100 gig port. It's the same set of switches that all of you guys tested a couple of days ago. Um, the Cat 9Ks and the Allied Telesis switches and all the other things. So that portion of the hardware remains the same. So with that said, as I said, we run the entire infrastructure on cloud, but what we believe Faucet provides is basically it enables you to control and monitor switches. Multi-vendor is a very key differentiator, and one of the cool things about Faucet, in our opinion, is it actually enables you to run the hardware as a software infrastructure. So we have a microservices infrastructure on cloud. I mean, you can go to any software related conference and Kubernetes and whatever it is. People talk about all of those kinds of things. But ultimately, why are they talking about that? Because they want an agile infrastructure that they can actually run and use. And what we believe is that through Faucet, we can actually do the same thing for the hardware, especially on the networking layer. So that is our way of looking at the problem. Um, you have all this standard set of things there in terms of the switch capabilities that Faucet requires, but there are some specific things that need to happen when you have to connect the same switch to our service fractal cloud. The first and foremost is that it has to support TLS. So what that means is that if you have a Zodiac FX, it does not work with our stuff. But if you have a Zodiac GX, then it can work because the FX does not support TLS. It's a very small form factor switch. Then the other things that we really like, which are not there consistently across all the vendors, are like DNS support, and which I'm going to talk about it in a little bit detail, and also TLS, SNI, and some of those things, and also finally the dial-out capability from a GNMI or a GNOI kind of an interface. So we have looked at this, I think, a year and a half ago. I think Mark did some work on how to do the GNMI dial-out. We never pushed it back into the main thing because we got so busy and on other things that we had to answer to, and we did not complete that work, so as to say. But currently, I mean, I think now they do have a proposal for dial out from GNMI. You have to understand that why we need dial out. It's mainly because of the fact that once you deploy something, and if you have to have the network operators trying to punch holes into the firewalls to allow a particular port, it's basically a non-starter to get any deployments done from a production point of view. So, but if you have a dial out, there's possibly a much easier methodology. So,
do any devices currently support that, or do you have to use sort of customized firmware and some other software
for the GNMI?
Yeah, for the outbound GNMI.
I haven't tested it. I don't think so. Do you guys have GNMI dial out? No, right? I don't think so.
That seems unusual.
Yeah. So it's basically so brand new at that time. I mean, we looked at the spec and it was not serving. So that's the point that I wanted to make. So having said that, so we have the ability to deploy, we have the ability to provision a brand new tenant in less than, I call it 60 minutes, but we can actually do it in a 15 minutes or 20 minutes and test it and that kind of stuff. It's all fully automated. But the biggest challenge is that it requires at least 30 minutes for us to onboard a switch. And why is that? These are the observations. I intend no disrespect to any of the vendors who are here, who have put in a lot of effort to get all of these things going, but still, I will share this. Every time I have to put the switch in an open flow mode, you have to run a whole bunch of commands in order to get it working to a particular level, okay, to make it. So I have documented in the vendor specific documentation stuff for the faucet. I have updated a few things apart from the things that are there. But that is a big, um, I should say, turn off from a customer point of view. That's one thing. Maybe there are ways to automate it. Maybe you guys can just educate me, and if I can automate all of that stuff for them, then uh, it makes it their life easier and our life easier too. You still have to, once the configuration is done, then you have to reboot the switch, because that's when the new thing comes up. um, then the other thing that needs to also happen is you can actually select how many ports you want to put it in the open flow mode. So now you have to collect all of this information, get the DPID, get the port information and everything, and you have to make a list. Normally, if you're doing a console cable, uh, you have another problem. You have to cut and paste all of this information and send it to the faucet YAML. So that's another effort that is required. Maybe that there are ways to help get that information in a much more easier way. Maybe I can write a program or whatever it is that could be done. That's one of the other things. The other thing is about key provisioning. So this is a huge challenge in a way, in the sense that um, y- you have to. I mean, this was done a long time ago. Whatever Cisco did, the way that I looked at it, if you know as to how to do it on a Cisco box, you probably know as to how to do. It's almost very similar to do the same things in HP and Allied Telesis and all the other vendors. So there are a whole bunch of steps that you have to really do and understand. One is that you have to generate a trust anchor. You have to create a trust anchor. You have to generate the private key on the switch. That's fairly understandable. Generate the CSR. You have to plug all. There is a whole bunch of steps that you have to really do carefully in order to make sure that all of these things are working. And one of the mistakes that I used to make very early on, I mean, there is so much of documentation. Of course, I would glance over it thinking that I know this stuff a little bit too well. Okay, so my mistake, but still a challenge. I would take the entire cert chain. Hey, I mean, we had a GoDaddy provide the certs and that kind of stuff. So I have the entire cert chain. I used to stick it into that, and the damn thing wouldn't work. And I was wondering why the heck not. And finally, I had to go back and do all the reverse engineering and figure out all that it cared was the last cert that it was getting. So it did not. Some people, some on some boxes they took the entire cert chain, but they did not complain. On some boxes they basically said, oh, no, I cannot take the cert chain. You have to only provide me the root certificate. So what does root mean? There was a question, and the bottom line is it's basically the last one that is signed the certificate. So these are some of the hard lessons that I learned, and so maybe there are things that we could make it appropriate. The other thing is it also does not say what are the certificate fields that need to be configured and how they need to be configured. So you have to go back, and I had to delete all the trust anchors, set it up properly again, and come back again and do all of these things, like locality and that kind of. Because in our process, it does not work if you provide a incomplete cert with all the information, incomplete information, and that kind of stuff. So we do some uh, checks. Uh, we talked about control channel, separate control channel in the earlier this morning and that kind of stuff. So uh, probably that has people haven't really um, talked much about it because they haven't deployed this at this point in time that much. But I think that could be a question that comes along, but I don't know what the answer is. But at the same time, I'm going to basically talk about the risk and reward and how many ports you're going to use out of all of these things for now. And but that's a topic for another day. But something that I always keep in the back of my mind, because you're losing one more port if you're using a control channel. Of course, you can do MAC VLANs and that kind of stuff, but that's a different thing. I already talked about capturing the DPID. So basically, this is basically all the inventory that I need for me to push it into the YAML file. So from the switch, if there are ways that we could kind of automate a little bit, try to get all this information, maybe we can reduce some errors in terms of typing things and that kind of stuff. And that is one thing that I could look at. DNS support. So I think it was a year and a half ago, or I don't remember, probably 2 years ago is when I started talking about DNS support on switches. So the first thing that we encountered was we run a fully microservices architecture uh, on our cloud, and IP addresses are a premium, but still the challenge is that we use all FQDNs or fully qualified domain names on our for each and every tenant and that kind of stuff, and because we also issue certificates accordingly and so on. But on the switches, when you have to set up the controller, you are basically talking about um, configuring the IP address for a particular controller, and that causes problems because I made a mistake yesterday night. I basically said a domain name. I had misspelled it, and I created a brand new tenant. And the easiest way for us is delete the tenant and recreate it with a new one. And it's actually a lot more easier as compared to I don't have to change anything in 100 different places or whatever it is, because I can go back to full recovery in 15 minutes. So that's our model. So we don't have to go back and change anything. We just go back and recreate it, which is actually faster. So when you try to do that, of course, you have a new IP address, but guess what? Now you have to go tell the network operator to change the IP address that you have actually programmed on the switch to a different controller IP, and that's a huge problem. Okay, um, that's the other thing. And also, when you start using IPs, then you get into routing policies and that kind of stuff that might also be there. I don't know what the implications are when you move a switch from one place to the other. Each and every network team does it a little bit differently, and I don't want to go there understanding what happens and that kind of stuff. Uh, of course, use of FQDN relies on DNS infrastructure, so that's another thing. There is also another aspect of DNS. I mean, if you use like a TLS SNI support or an encrypted SNI, that is actually even cooler. Because today, what we do is that when you do a controller, set controller, you say a protocol, whether it's SSL or whatever it is, and you give an IP address, and then you give a port number. Well, if you use a TLS SNI, that's basically, we can provide you with certificates which can actually say, hey, controller, this is for the controller, this is for the telemetry, this is for the other thing, and so on and so forth. Then you don't even have to have port numbers. And why is this so important? Because then I'm only going to expose 443 on my reverse proxy in the front end, and that knows as to how to channel it to all the other services accordingly. Right now, I have to open 6653 or whatever port numbers that I select, and so on and so forth. And I have to do testing, security testing, and that kind of stuff. That's another problem for us. Okay, so if we can do just 443, then I will do the standard set of tests and be done with it, because my life is a little bit more simpler. Um, there is a new proposal on encrypted SNI, because host names were getting exposed, and you can do encrypted SNI. Actually, for the DNS support, OVS 2.10 has the DNS support. Ben put that in. In the 2.12, they also have the TLS SNI support in OVS. I have to check if I can do just TSNI or whatever it is, and then just give the FQDN as compared to the port number. That's something that I need to check. So I don't know if that feature got in. I did not talk to Ben about that, so I forgot. So that's the only other thing that I need to check. But it's there. If it is not complete, it will be complete in the next release. So I already talked about GNMI. Okay, so. basically these are the open questions that I have for you guys. What can we do in terms of simplifying switch provisioning, if any? Okay. um, and how can I provision the switch a lot more faster? How can I onboard the switch a lot more faster? Switch vendors, any of your thoughts?
So a lot of these things, I think,
But does that mean that when you say zero touch provisioning, does that mean that I need one of your Cisco DNA or one of those things? Okay.
to that we
Okay.
and we feeding whatever they
I see. So, because the reason as to why I ask is, I mean, this is already, I want to keep it as bare bones as possible, because just like what Faucet does, because then life becomes easier for everybody. So if that works, I mean, we can actually automate it and test it and see if that greatly helps.
the cycle that we have this
I see. Right.
So, I mean, there's a lot of ways to put config on a switch. Most basic one is jam some stuff out over serial, right? ETP config there. ECP there. Three vendors, there's ETP product, there's GNMI.
Yeah, I mean, if you start doing serial, and because not everybody supports SSH, I mean, you have to do some basic configuration, but at the same point in time, I'm not saying that you cannot do any of those things. Can we just let us assume that you have a REST API or whatever it is that is there, bare minimal? If I can just, I mean, all that I'm saying is, hey, can I get configure OpenFlow? It should do whatever it is that is needed at the back end in order to configure OpenFlow. A simple thing like that for each of these switches. So just like in Faucet, we basically say you have a VLAN or you have we don't care about the implementation underneath, but the stuff works, whether it's switch stacking or VLAN or any of those things. See, if we can make it a little bit more faster, we can onboard a switch a lot more faster. So that's all I'm trying to say. If we have to say we have to use like serial and scrape and do all kinds of fancy scripting, then I don't think so. We are still going to get away from that.
You had the talk at last ForceCon on
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think so. I was there. Yeah, I was there.
point.
I hear you, but I want dial out and some of those other things. Yes.
other solution might be turn this around and say like
Yes.
rather than saying like how it's top model for like local home switching by default.
Correct.
You might say firmware option or wait switch actually got
Correct.
flows on by default. Like three things.
Correct. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, allied telesis, and we have discussed this, and so when the customer really wants AT switch and they want a service with us, so we have a plan to basically provision our keys and everything on that, so that when they go and put it out there, it's automatically there.
Perhaps not even well, but
It's already pre-provisioned for all the things that we are talking about. Correct.
there might be like a more minimal. You say like put enough on by default. What if we're in the duration?
Correct.
Another way is to, rather than enable more ways to configure things. Enable the open flow.
Correct. That's all that's exactly what I'm saying. Enable OpenFlow, and then set this controller or generate the keys, do whatever it is that you have to do. um, and how can we if make it easier for them to get the keys on the sign the certificate, and even if you have to cook up a personalized version of Acme protocol, like what Let's Encrypt does or whatever it is, in order to basically get it up. I think there are ways that we can actually do. Hopefully, I think, wherein we can make it a little bit more simpler, a little bit less harsher, so as to say, is the underlying thought process here. And also, I want to just focus on a few things. I don't want to boil the ocean, basically talking about DNS and controller and a few settings. It's not that I'm asking for.
Yeah, I might mention you may get a compromise on for file training. Tip right there, it's a tip. Little like, what about break mode? Those are great, those are great.
Okay.
So like, it's basically you can figure out the box and what you switch.
Okay. Yes, sir.
On a server not doing any work. So a lot of these, a lot of the support. There is so phoning home, dialing from inside GNMI, and your embed control problem. The fact that you switch and flows programmed into it. I think a lot of these could go away if you just shut it. Can you speak to kind of the business imperative beyond
Yeah.
having no controller on site?
So the idea is that, let's say that you have a branch office, or let's say a coffee shop, Starbucks, whatever it is. The idea is to not do a truck roll. If you have even a single box which it doesn't matter whether you run a Raspberry Pi or whether you run a $20,000 server with fancy software on it. I mean, when something happens on that store, you have to do a truck roll. You always have to plan for it. It's a cost. Whether you have to have spares and that kind of stuff. Here, what we are saying is you don't need to have any other network management software. Your switch is directly connecting to the cloud, and you are managing everything from the cloud. So you are basically taking out all of those costs. Whether there are people who would want that kind of stuff. So, and also they might not have operators.
This is a Meraki model.
Yes, in a way, yes.
But Meraki's custom firmware.
Yeah, Meraki, you have to buy the entire stack.
Switch vendors kind of list things just to the point we start.
The model is this, and we do have an on-prem local survivability thing that we are working on, but at the same time, that is there for a variety of purposes. But the ideal model is that even Meraki, I mean, nobody cares. They're all comfortable managing it from the cloud. Okay, so I think that model has been very well established, and people are comfortable with that. There are some cases where you do need local survivability, and that's an answer that we are working on. But it's not really required for every place. And the lesser pieces of software and hardware that you have there, in order to make all of these things work, they're happy actually. Go ahead.
So we were talking this morning about control plane redundancy.
Mm-hmm.
People were worried about a single cable breaking. In this model, for your faucet to work, it depends on it.
Correct.
Do you speak to people's risk appetites to having their local network go down
When I talk about, I mean, so the first and foremost is when I talk about their SD-WAN, I ask them, hey, do you have SD-WAN? What happens if it goes down? Do you have Cisco, Meraki, or HP, Aruba cloud-based control solutions? Most of them do have, and they basically say, okay, yeah, hey, if that works, then this also works. They haven't really given me a hard time, at least in the small segment of people that I have spoken to. They haven't given me a hard time. The other question that I have been asked is, hey, there is also one other point that I don't think so. I think I had that note, but I glanced over it probably. the number of controllers that you can program on a switch. Okay, currently there's a very small number. I think in some cases I can only program like 3 controllers and that kind of stuff. So the way I looked at it is, if you have one for, let's assume faucet and gauge for a minute. You have one for faucet, one for gauge. If you have a high availability, you have 2 more of that, and you have a local survivability, you have another one. So you already landed up with 5. So that could be, how can we increase the number of controllers so that we can be programmed on the switch? That's another thing. Did I answer your question? Sorry, I can tangentially, I think. Yes, sir.
Question, in your setup, curious to know, how many ports are really managed by faucet, or do you use a combination of faucet and some other controller?
No, everything is managed by faucet.
Faucet.
Yeah.
You have a number of ports or switches that are being managed actively?
I would say that it is actually much less than, because I have a lot more switches. I have like 12 or 15 switches, and I don't have that many hosts, okay, to pump traffic. So I think Brad runs the biggest network in that. Oh yeah, of course. So that's it. So that's all I have. By the way, if you are interested in deploying, you don't have to deploy any of these Kubernetes, and you don't have to learn about all of that stuff. You can just call me and we can set it up, and you can connect your switch directly to the cloud. You're up and running. Even in this so-called tedious process of provisioning that I call TDS, it's still 30 minutes. So which is actually a huge time saver. Cool. Thank you.